Okay. But we won't have it posted anywhere online, but I will share the link itself. And I will also send out my slides at the end in PDF form. So one of my kind of theories on slides is that I know a lot of folks end up wanting the details. And so you might notice that my slides are a little bit wordy, but that is so that you kind of have a document at the end that you feel like you can reference really easily, where you're not like, wait, what was this picture about? So sorry if that drives your PowerPoint brain crazy, but that is why I'm doing it that way. So just as an orientation to what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to go over just the basics of growing vegetables, and that really is going to be a lot of soil basics, growing systems, nutrition, watering, and pest management. So just basics that work for warm season, cool season, works for basically anything you want to grow, even ornamental. And then we're going to have, in the second half of the talk, we're going to have entirely about starting plants from seed. So choosing varieties and materials, moving them from seed to outside, and warm season veggies. And I don't know why that appeared, but it did. Ooh.
That is something that we would like to stop, and that is annotation, and we would like to not have that happen here. Thank you very much. Ashley, while we're working on that security piece, can you tell me how you want to handle the questions, dear?
Yeah, so if we can just collect questions throughout the first and second half of the talk, I'll answer them at our break. Don't worry, I'll make sure that we're all present when we do that, and we'll also answer them at the end. So,
so questions during question and answer period.
Yeah, I think so. Okay. Because otherwise I can get a little off track.
All righty.
You'll end up seeing this devolve into like Ashley's fun facts, which is fun, but not what we're here for. So we'll do that way. So just as kind of a little bit of orientation to what we're doing kind of broadly, this is, as you might know, right, one of a multi-part series, right? So there's plenty of upcoming workshops that we're offering both in person and online. All of our in-person events will be held out at the Briggs Avenue Community Garden. They are very limited spaces in those for obvious reasons. We'll be doing masks, social distancing, all that, but it's a great way to kind of get your hands dirty and learn some basic techniques of things like grafting, season extension, planting pollinator-friendly plants, both for ornamental gardens and to support your edible garden. And we have a whole series of kind of more of these in-depth talks that we're also offering. So go online, check those out. This is the first class of that series. And there should be a lot of kind of interesting content there, I'm hoping. A lot of you might be familiar with this, and a lot of you might be like, I signed up for this talk because I thought it was cool. I have never heard of cooperative extension, right? So cooperative extension, which is the agency I work for, it's what runs the Master Gardener program. We are really a nationwide network of educators, researchers, and volunteers. So cooperative extension actually exists in every state in the country, and in North Carolina, we are lucky enough to have cooperative extension in every county in the state. So it's 101 offices because it includes the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Here in North Carolina, cooperative extension is really a partnership between North Carolina State University, North Carolina A&T, and Durham County. So we do all sorts of stuff. We kind of do everything that runs local gamut. And so the way we deliver educational information is workshops, classes, field days, tours. We also do a lot of written resources. We love to send you a resource that's got a lot of good in-depth information. It's all research-based. That's really what cooperative extension is all about, is getting you really good research-based answers. So stuff that's coming from the universities. We also do personal consultations. We do phone, email, and in person, obviously with restrictions right now. And one of the really cool things about our office here in Durham is that we have a lot of the traditional programs like agriculture, family and consumer sciences, which I like to describe as like everything you wish you had learned in home ec, right? So it's nutrition, it's financial stuff, it's all that kind of stuff. We do 4-H for kids, Master Gardeners, obviously, but we also do Welcome Baby, which is support for babies 0 to 5. We do kids voting, which supports civic engagement for kids. So we do all sorts of kind of really, really cool programs that a lot of other counties don't do. The program that might be most relevant to you guys, to this crew, and I know we have a lot of folks in the audience, is the Master Gardener program. So the Durham Master Gardeners receive really extensive training. They go through about a 16-week training class to volunteer with us. They have to do ongoing education, and they really are experts at finding answers and kind of helping you track down your weird gardening problems. I oversee that program, and they are a delight to work with. They can give talks, they can do any number of different things, and they're really just here to help the gardeners of Durham figure out how to do what they're doing better, right? And to help you solve your problems and answer your questions. Normally we have office hours. Obviously we don't right now, but we are still maintaining virtual office hours via email and phone. And I'll include all of this information in an email at the end. If you think that's all pretty cool, but you're shy, I get it. You just want to snoop on the Master Gardeners for a minute before you actually reach out. They maintain a very active blog. They also have Facebook and Instagram accounts full of really great content, to-do calendars for the month, interesting pictures from the garden. We had a great series last year that was someone like documenting the fox kits that were living in their barn. So just like charming content too. And this year especially is really exciting, and it's a good time to start seeing what the Master Gardeners are up to, because we are having a training class this year. So we only do training for Master Gardeners every other year because, again, it's a 16-week class. It's pretty intensive, but we'll be having a training this fall. If you want to learn more about that and what it kind of entails and how to become a Master Gardener volunteer, check out this link. It has all of the information on that and can get you signed up for an information session where you can learn more about that program. It's a really great group. We have about 100 folks who are dedicating their time and their expertise, and also are just like a delight to be around. So if you're interested, it's a great opportunity. One last resource I'd like to share before we kind of dive right in is the Extension Gardener Handbook. So the Extension Gardener Handbook is super cool because it was actually written by faculty and extension agents across the state. And it was written for North Carolina, right? It is the North Carolina Extension Gardener Handbook, and it was written by specialists from North Carolina State University just for us. It's actually written very, very recently within the last couple of years, and it's updated regularly. For example, the talk you're about to hear, a lot of it is chapter 16 of the North Carolina Extension Gardener Handbook. You can get a hard copy of it, you can pay money for it. It is also online free, right? You can just read it, you can peruse it, and that free version is updated regularly. And again, it's just like got chapters on everything from, permaculture to vegetable gardening to ornamentals to turf care to anything you might want as a home gardener. And it's really kind of just a great resource, and it's really rooted in North Carolina, which I just love. So that is a super cool thing to check out too, and to learn more about any of these topics. So that's a whole bunch of background. Now you know what extension is, now you know what we're doing here. But let's dive right into growing vegetables, right? So this is a picture I love. This is actually a picture of Craig LaHoulier's garden from when he used to live in Raleigh, North Carolina. Craig LaHoulier, the NC tomato man. He wrote a book called Epic Tomatoes, and he's done a lot of really amazing work to develop dwarf tomatoes. And this is a picture I like to share right at the very beginning, because vegetable gardening does not have to be a pristine piece of soil that is like perfect in every way, right? Craig used to have no sunlight in the place where he needed it, so he colonized his driveway, right, with like bags and old pots, and he made it work and would develop whole new cultivars of tomatoes, whole new varieties of tomatoes, right? So really anybody can make this work, which I think is just super inspiring. Part of what you might gather from that is that sun is really important, right? So a lot of times where you, especially in Durham, because we have so many big, beautiful trees, a lot of times where you put your garden is going to just be a product of where you've got sun. As gardeners, we are a very optimistic group in that we will read any tag, no matter how much sun it says it needs, and go, yes, my shady yard has that much sun, and we will plant it and hope for the best. Unfortunately, with vegetables, you actually really do need that much sun, right? You need at least 6 to 8 hours per day. One thing to be aware of is there might be spots in your yard where you actually do get that much sun in the summer, but don't get it in the winter. So don't despair if you can't find that spot right now. Check again in like June. But at least 6 to 8 hours per day. And the reason for that is really that with fruits and vegetables, right, we're not asking them to just survive. We're asking them to thrive. We're asking them to be so successful that they can basically spare parts of themselves, right? Like that they can produce extra structures for us to take. So they really do need that much sunlight. They also need well-prepared soil. So this is a pH of 6 to 6.5. Our native North Carolina soil in this area tends to be a fair bit lower than that, often around 5, if not lower. pH is actually a logarithmic scale, which means that the difference between 5 and 6 is actually huge. So it's worth getting your soil tested, and we'll talk more about that, but just know that there is kind of an ideal pH range for growing vegetables. They also need adequate nutrients and organic matter. And again, that goes back to the idea of fruits and veggies basically have to be firing on all cylinders all the time for us to get what we want out of them. And finally, they need consistent water supply, but they also need good drainage, right? So that's one of the fun things about North Carolina and our clay soils is that they are water retentive soils. And so there's some easy ways to get around that though. Part of what you might be picking up on, right, is that it's all about the soil. So I have a whole another talk in this series that's just about soil. I think it's foundational. I think every talk could actually just in some ways be a talk about soil, but we're going to take a minute here to just talk about what I actually mean when I say it's all about the soil, right? So a little bit of soil basics. So different types of plants like different types of soils, as you might imagine, right? Like a cactus wants something different than a houseplant. But from a vegetable garden's perspective, there is an ideal soil, right? And what an ideal soil is the easiest way to think about it is the proportion of space to stuff, right? So a soil is comprised of all these different little soil particles, and then there's also space between those soil particles. So the stuff is made up of mineral matter, so broken down rocks, different elements, different nutrients, right? And also organic matter, right? So what we think of almost as like compost. The space, all of that can be either filled with air or with water. So all the space between the soil particles, right? So in an ideal soil, you want it to be about 45% mineral, so about 45% broken down rock, about 5% organic material. And then all of the space, all the rest of it, that's about actually half of it, right? There's a lot of space between all those little soil particles. And you want about half of that to be filled with air and about half of it to be filled with water, right? So that all sounds kind of conceptual, but you can kind of imagine, right, that you want the roots need to be able to go through the soil, so they need some kind of space to crawl through, but they also need nutrients, so they need some stuff to grab, right? That kind of makes sense. Note on Durham soil though, right? And this is actually where this stuff component, this mineral component becomes very, very important to understand. Soil is made up of 3 major particle sizes. It's made up of sand. You can think of sand as being almost like the size of a beach ball, right? And then it has the smaller particle is silt. You can think about silt as being like a tennis ball, but not fuzzy, right? But if you think about those relative sizes we're working on, right? And then there's clay. And you can think about clay as being like a grain of rice, right? So it's substantially smaller. And also, importantly, it's shaped differently, right? If you put a bunch of beach balls in a tub, there's a lot of space between them, right? So that's why when you pour water through sand, it just pours right out. But if you put a bunch of grains of rice in a bucket, right, they all kind of stack up on top of each other really cleanly, relatively cleanly. And if you tried to pour water through a bucket of rice, that would take longer, right? And so Durham soils, and just in case you're like, I love a ball metaphor, but like I need a, an actual image, right? This is a good comparison of, on the left here, you can see we have that's sand, right? And then here is the sort of clay that we have, right? Where it's actually flat and it is on itself really, really tightly, right? And so Durham soils, for the most part, are made up with a lot of clay, right? And so that's why they're water retentive. So water has a hard time moving through them, and that can make it really difficult for us because our soils become waterlogged and our plants can actually drown, right? Also, it just creates a really good disease condition because there's just too much moisture and too much water around. And so the one magical thing about soil, though, is that this is just about that mineral component, right? That 45% mineral component. That other 5%, that organic components, we think about compost. Compost is actually really, really, really amazing. Compost not only makes sand hold water better, it actually helps clay move water through more efficiently. It like takes everything and just kind of makes it better, right? And so that's why we strive for 5% organic matter in our soils. We have a really, really warm climate with a lot of water, which is really, really, really good for the bacteria that like to chomp on and eat organic matter. And so it can actually be really hard for us to have enough organic matter in our soils. So a lot of times our clay soils are really hard to work with actually because they don't have enough organic matter. And if we just added organic matter, if we just kind of amended it and cut in compost into our soils, they would actually have an overall improved structure and they would deal with water better. So what can you do, right? Compost, like add compost, but there are different ways to do that. So you can grow your own organic matter. So this is things like green manures where you actually basically grow things on your beds during off seasons, and then you basically like cut those in. So a lot of times you'll do this during the winter where you might grow clover, winter wheat, any things like this. Not only do they allow you to add their organic matter later, they also protect the soil when it's not in use. So that's really, really useful, right? You always want to keep your soil covered because it's really, really easy for soil to wash away. So when you grow these sorts of green organic matters over the soil, cover crops is another thing you might hear them called, that helps protect the soil, and it also allows you to cut all that matter in later. One of my absolute favorite recommendations if you're looking into cover crops and to help you improve your soil is actually crimson clover. Crimson clover is really, really amazing because not only does it protect your soil, but it's also really pretty, but it also, it actually adds nitrogen to your soil. So you'll hear this sometimes that legumes or the beans add nitrogen to the soil. That is because they have special structures on their roots, special little nodules that help them pull nitrogen from the air and hold it for themselves. And when you kill them and their roots start breaking down, that nitrogen is then released into the summer or into the soil. So something to kind of note there is that when you grow something like crimson clover and you grow it to add nitrogen to your soil, make sure you leave those roots in place, right? Like the crimson clover is not collecting this nitrogen because it's generous, it's collecting it for itself. So you need to leave those roots in place to allow them to decay and release that nitrogen. So that's a little bit about soil. The take home there is like add compost, add organic matter, keep an eye on it, make sure that you're just kind of always keeping your soil covered, you're taking care of your soil, and your soil will just do much better. Once you have that in mind, there are a couple different ways you can set up your actual planting scheme. 3 of the major ways that we'll talk about are rows, raised beds, and containers. So rows are a really, really traditional method, and there's some real benefit to them. So raised rows help drainage. So what I mean by this is, like, you can see, sorry, I have another screen over here, that's what I'm looking at. You can see right here where the soil is actually mounded up a little bit, right? There's like a high point where they're growing and then low points in between in the inter-row space. So that's really, really smart to do here in North Carolina, especially because we have that clay soil that retains water. So when you build things up slightly and you mound them up, it improves drainage, right? Because they're not just sitting flush at ground level. So that's really nice. Rows can also be really easy to maintain. They're big, they're long, they're straight. You plant the same thing in the whole row, and it's just easy to kind of move down and know what you're doing, right? Rows can be wide enough for single or double lines of crops, so 2 to 3 feet. So you can see here, right, this is a 2 crop system, like 2 rows, like 2 line per row system, sorry. And you generally need about 1 foot to 2 feet between rows, and that's especially because you might be using a little bit more small machinery on systems like this, and so you want to be able to move kind of easily through. One of my favorite things about rows that I actually think is really nice and is can be really, really attractive is that oftentimes you will see rows where people plant vegetables, every 3 rows, and then they plant a row of flowers, and then they do vegetables, flowers. And that's actually really, really good because it can help attract pollinators that will actually help improve your pollination throughout the rest of the rows and throughout your vegetables. Also, flowers are just pretty, right? So like it's nice from that perspective as well. Something you might be more familiar with, and especially folks who might be living downtown or in small spaces, are raised beds. Raised beds. So I'm originally from Indiana, so when I moved down here and everyone had raised beds, I was like, oh, those are so cute. No, yeah, well, they are cute, but the actual thing is that raised beds really help improve drainage. And they also oftentimes can raise the root system of that plant up away from the soil, which in city settings can be really, really nice because it means you can have, especially if you have a tall raised bed, I'm talking like 24 inches, you can basically have plants growing and for the most part not interacting with the soil underneath the raised bed, which if you have any concern about anything going on with that soil can be really, really helpful. They can be made high enough to provide easy access. So if you have any sort of mobility issues, bending issues, it's nice to have those beds really raised up so they're easy to interact with. And weed control is much easier in raised beds, right? In rows, the weeds can kind of always be coming in and over. In raised beds, the weeds have to jump, right? And that'll happen because wildlife and critters and just weeds are wily, but it's a lot easier and you kind of have a really discrete area to control weeds in. So it's really nice that way. Some things about raised beds, some specifics, you want them no more than 4 feet wide. In all of these systems, and just in soil care in general, you actually really, really, really want to minimize stepping on the soil, right? So in your rows, in your raised beds, even in your garden beds, you don't want to step on the soil as much as you can help prevent it. So no more than 4 feet wide means that you can easily reach into the middle for anything you want to do. They need to be at least 8 inches deep to get that drainage benefit. And if you're making them over a hard surface, they should be probably 2 to 3 feet deep. Similarly, if you're making them, so that would be like a raised bed, like on a driveway. Similarly, if you're making them over a surface where you have any concern about the soil underneath, just even because of contamination issues, you want to be at least probably 3 feet up. And when you're filling your raised beds, fill them with a mix of soil and compost. And I would start with probably at least 75% soil. A word of caution on this is that if you go to many stores and you try to buy soil, like garden soil, most of those products are actually considered soilless media and that they have no mineral component. They are entirely organic. So they are like made up of all sorts of different kind of organic byproducts. Make sure you're using actual soil. So a lot of times what you end up buying is you end up buying that super cheap topsoil, right? It's not called garden soil. It's not called potting soil. It's not called anything like that. It's called topsoil. Or even better, if you have a truck or you have a friend with a truck, just go buy like a yard of topsoil from one of the local stone places, because that will be kind of a good product to get you started. The reason for that is too much organic matter actually is very hard for plants to grow in. It can get to a point where if it dries out too much, it's hard for it to take on water, which can be very stressful for plants. And your soil line will just keep dropping because that compost will keep getting eaten by the microbes in the environment. And so you'll constantly be replacing it and it'll be pretty frustrating. Another option you have if you don't even have room for a raised bed is containers, right? Containers are absolutely great for limited space. They're also great for areas where you know you've had different disease contaminants in the past because it's totally fresh soil, right? Larger plants need larger containers, right? That seems pretty straightforward. Some of the bigger tomatoes can require pretty big pots to really have enough room. So oftentimes you pick smaller varieties for containers. And for best results, use potting soil, not garden soil, right? So this is actually where you want that specially kind of engineered potting soil, right? That soilless media, and that works really well. Slow release fertilizers work really well. So we'll talk about fertilizer types in just a minute. And there's no need to soil test because you'll know exactly what's in that product based on what's in the bag. If the soil that you're using contains any amount of fertilizer, it will also have to be listed in the bag. The only downside to containers really is you have to water them daily, especially in the summer. In our hot summers, you gotta water daily. The plants will get stressed. They will wear it on their sleeves. You will just know that they are not feeling good about what's happening. So if you wanna get into a daily practice around plant watering, this is actually a really good way to grow. If you know you're the kind of person who can't do that, maybe think about a different method. One more kind of what I consider a little bit complicated, but certainly doable way of growing is straw bale gardening. This is good for limited space in areas with history of soil-borne diseases. So vegetables are actually grown in prepared bales of straw. What you do is there's actually some fancy footwork you can do in the beginning to speed up the decomposition process to actually start breaking the straw bale down, and then the plants can grow in that broken down material. You basically fertilize, water, and allow to rot for 2 to 4 weeks. So the major point here is that if you're interested in straw bale gardening, totally doable, but there is a process. It's not just sticking veggies in straw bales. And if you want to learn more about that, reach out to the master gardeners, reach out to me, and we can kind of walk you through what that is. Again, super doable, will require watering daily, but it's kind of like a fun process. So you have, sorry, I don't normally talk this much anymore. So you have your soil sorted a little bit. You have an idea of how you want to plant. Now there's actually keeping the plants healthy and happy, right? The first major part of this, what we're going to talk about, is nutrition and fertilization. So on any bag of fertilizer, you will see 3 numbers, right? It's always like kind of big. And those are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And they are always listed in that order. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as NPK. Those are the elemental symbols for those. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are really, really important as macronutrients for plants. There are a number of nutrients that are very important for plant growth, essential for plant growth at different levels. And these are kind of like the big 3, right? They have to be there. The numbers that you see on the bag are percentages. So for example, the bag on the right would be 32% nitrogen. And it must be stated on the bag for all fertilizers, and it has to be tested, right? So those numbers that you see on there are good and they're right. So thinking a little bit about the big 3 nutrients. Just as a side note, in North Carolina, you typically don't have to worry about most of the other nutrients, especially as a home gardener, because our clay soils, even though they retain water, they also retain nutrients. And so they're actually like little like nutrient bombs, and plants love them from that perspective. But these are the 3 you might have to think about. So nitrogen promotes green leafy growth, right? It's really, really good for just kind of getting those leaves going, getting the plant fleshed out. It's something that typically fertilizers that are applied before something starts fruiting and flowering are typically higher in nitrogen, for example. So you can see just the green bits. Some of the deficiency symptoms, including yellowing, and starts on the lower leaves and works the way up the plant. So this is something that's kind of like good to know in general, is that typically if you see really specific yellowing patterns on your plant, it could be, oh, it's just the top leaves. Oh, it's just the bottom leaves. Oh, it's just the veins of the leaves. Oh, it's just in between the veins of the leaves. Those are actually all really different specific nutrient deficiency symptoms. And if you ever see that going on, bring in a sample or send pictures to us and we can help you diagnose it as best we can. So nitrogen deficiency will start as yellowing on the lower leaves. The plants will be stunted and fail to grow. And too much nitrogen, on the other hand, can actually cause plants to shed flowers and not set fruit. This is especially true for tomatoes and beans. So if you really over apply nitrogen, you will get a tomato plant that is like luscious and green and beautiful and never sets fruit, right? So like, because it's going gangbusters on green growth, right? Phosphorus is kind of just the opposite, right? It's about root, flower, and seed and fruit development, right? So it's about all those other structures. Something of note about phosphorus here in this area especially is to apply it only if the soil test indicates that you need it. We'll talk more about soil tests in a second. Phosphorus, too much phosphorus can lead to a lot of water quality issues, especially in our lakes and streams. And because, this is a fun kind of history fact, the soils in North Carolina actually are naturally extremely low in phosphorus. And so when farmers started figuring out that adding phosphorus made things better, phosphorus became like the wonder fertilizer for North Carolina. And so it was just massively over applied for like a century, especially as part of our tobacco industry. And so what that means is that our phosphorus levels here in North Carolina now, it's called legacy phosphorus because it's that phosphorus that was applied over the last 100 years, are so high, we're still having really serious water quality issues. And it means that you might well not need phosphorus, right? Because like phosphorus was just dumped everywhere for the longest time. So I wouldn't apply phosphorus unless I had a test result showing me I needed phosphorus. Finally, potassium, the K of NPK, is really good for overall plant health and growth. So it helps increase disease resistance, cold hardiness, and drought tolerance. You also hear it called potash or potash. And it leaches at a moderate rate. And what I mean by leaches is that when water moves through the soil, the water and the potassium can hook up with each other and then kind of travel on down together. So you might need potassium, right? Because it moves out of the soil a little bit more easily. All of this is kind of really interesting. I think that for the home gardener, it's always good to get a soil test. And again, we'll talk about that in a second. But if I could only fix one thing about my soil, right? Only one thing, it would actually be the pH. And the reason I say that, right, so we're talking about this 6 to 6.5 window, is so this graph I'm just about to show you, these are all essential plant nutrients, right? So you see nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium here at the top. You see some of the other ones down here at the bottom. And these are all really, really important. But what's actually really interesting about this is anywhere where you see these red colors, that's actually where it's become toxic based on pH, right? You have pH down here at the bottom. Anywhere where you see yellow, it's not that available. And anywhere where you see green, it's readily available to the plant. And that's because soil pH affects nutrient availability. So if the pH is wrong, it doesn't matter how much is there, the plant can't see it, or it might even become toxic to the plant. So what we're looking at right here is this 6 to 6.5 window, right? This is really a sweet spot where you get as many greens and as many yellows as you possibly can, right? Available to pretty available, right? So, and that's what, and you don't have any reds, right? You're kind of moving out of the toxicity range for a lot of these, which is really, really helpful. Maybe a little bit higher would be better, but it's actually pretty hard to get your soil kind of consistently at 6 to 6.5. So like it's what we would call, kind of close enough for horseshoes and hand grenades. You don't need to be too much higher than that to start seeing the benefits of the pH. So you're like, that's great, Ashley. Okay, NPK, pH. I got a lot of acronyms. Like, I don't know what to do with that because how do I actually know what my soil is? This is almost like a joke because anytime you talk to an extension agent, we're going to be like, but have you tested your soil, right? Anytime you talk to a master gardener, I'll be like, but have you tested your soil? But it's because it's really, really serious, really important, and dead easy. So start with soil sampling. So soil sampling, we have all of these supplies at the office. We actually even have them in a cabinet now on the north side of the office, so you can stop by at any time and grab them. From April through Thanksgiving, soil sampling is free. So you can just collect your little soil sample. We will drive it to the lab for you. The lab will do it for you for free and send you a readout. It's really easy. I would love to talk you through this. I would love to help you in whatever way I can with this because it's a really great process. At this time of year, soil sampling is the exorbitant fee of $4 a sample. Most people only need one sample. So, this is a really, really good place to start just to kind of give you peace of mind that you know what you're doing with your soil. So this is done by the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. They have a soils lab over in Raleigh. And what they'll do is they'll take your sample and they'll do all these fancy tests on it. And then they will give you a readout, which we're just going to talk about briefly for a second. Because it can be a little bit intimidating and I want you to feel like you've at least seen it before so that when you just call me and ask me to interpret it for you, you're like, oh yeah, I remember when we did this. So this is a typical readout from the soil lab. I love the soil lab because somebody actually worked really, really hard to make this easy to read. They just didn't explain it to anybody and they thought that adding graphs would make it less intimidating, which I was trained in scientists, so I love that sort of nerd science approach. So what this is basically there are a couple of major things you're going to look at for any sample. This is just for a single sample. So the first thing you're going to look at is this part on the left, right, where you're looking at just your pH. And so what they're telling you here is, okay, your pH for your sample is a 5.4. The optimum range is a 5.8 to a 6.5. We wish this bar were in the optimum range, but it's not. Don't worry, you can fix that by applying 40 pounds per 1,000 square feet of lime, right? Lime is the major thing that you're going to add here in this part of North Carolina to actually raise your soil pH. So they tell you exactly what you need to add, how much you need to add. And the cool thing about this too is that, this is for a flower garden, but they can do it for a vegetable garden. They can do it for any specific vegetables. And what they're doing is they're taking your specific soil and what you want to grow, and they're giving you recommendations to get you just right for what you want to grow based on your soil, which is super cool. Then they're going to walk you through what fertilizer you need for that thing you're going to grow, right? And so this is on the right. So they don't test for nitrogen actually because of the way the chemistry of nitrogen works in the soil. It's actually so all over the place that it's a lot easier to just give a recommendation than to try to test for it because it's really hard and wily to nail down. But they do test for phosphorus and potassium specifically. And the way they then give you those readouts is basically they work off of this index system. Right, it says phosphorus index, potassium index. This is where what I mean when I say someone worked really hard to make this easy to understand, but didn't explain it on the form. The index system just means it's a 0. They care about a 0 to 100 range. 0 to 25, like, oh, you really need to add that. Like, you'll be much happier and your plants will do much better if you add that. 25 to 50, you will see an improvement if you add that. 50 to 100, like, you're fine. Like, keep an eye on it, but it's fine. Like, your plants are not going to benefit from you adding anymore. They have enough, right? 100 plus, you've got enough. Don't worry about it. Like, don't add any more of this. You have enough. Just don't do this, right? So here you can see this is 54, right? So you're in that optimum range. This is 41. So you're below that optimum range, right? And then they're going to give you a really specific recommendation based on, we know you need nitrogen because you're always going to need nitrogen. You don't need phosphorus because it's in this optimum window. You need some potassium because you're below the optimum window. Again, I know this can be intimidating. It can be a lot. I'll walk you through it. Don't worry. This is like our bread and butter. We love doing it. I just want you to feel like you've seen it when you get your soil test report back. So now you know, okay, great. I need to add fertilizer. What fertilizer do I add? So there are a couple of major types that you can use. There are slow release fertilizers. These release nutrients over an extended period of time. A lot of times they're coated fertilizers. So things like Osmocote, there are a lot of organic options for this. These work really well because they kind of give you that long, this is like eating a big meal, but like a hearty meal, where you're going to feel full for a long time, right? That's kind of in contrast to soluble fertilizers. These are often applied as granules and they dissolve readily in the water. If you think about kind of the classic like 10-10-10, which is, 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 10% potassium, that's in that sort of range. That's like a good lunch. Like, you're going to be eating again soon, but like you ate, right? You ate. And then there are liquid fertilizers. This is like a power bar, right? They only provide a quick feed and they're only good for a fast boost. So it's going to be manure tea, fish emulsion, Miracle Grow, any of these things. They are super fast, but they also leave the soil pretty quickly and they lose their effectiveness pretty quickly. So if I was setting up beds for a long period, I want to focus more on those slow release fertilizers. Whereas liquid fertilizers are more for, I'm seeing nutrient deficiencies now, right? And I need to address it now. So I basically do not keep liquid fertilizers for the most part, except for seedlings and stuff, like very specific cases. But I don't use any liquid fertilizers on my vegetable beds. I like to focus on slow release. But I know some people who use liquids and they like them. One special note here, don't count on compost to do all of this for you, right? Compost actually has a very, very low nutrient value, right? It's great for organic matter, but that's not the same as nutrients. So the standard bag of like black cow, so cow manure compost, is actually a 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, right? That is a very, very low percentage of those three nutrients. So compost is doing great things for your soil, but it's not actually adding nutrients. Moving on, when it comes to water, most vegetables require about a water per week from rain or irrigation, right? This is actually true for new plantings in general, and vegetables only last a year, so they're always new plantings, right? So it's about an inch per week for the plants to be happy. You want to keep the top inch or the top foot of soil kind of consistently moist, not wet, but like if you dig your hand down in there, it should feel moist. But you also want to be really careful because wet foliage creates an increased disease problems. And the reason for that is because the longer the foliage is wet, the longer different fungal spores, bacterial things have a chance to kind of settle in and get happy and comfortable and attack those leaves, right? So you want to make sure to keep leaves as dry as you possibly can. What this often means is making sure that you're watering kind of really early in the morning so that the water can evaporate off, and also watering down at the base of the plants, not overhead. For pest management, a couple different ways you can go about this. This will also just kind of become like an ongoing fun thing to learn more about every time you vegetable garden. Don't feel bad. Everybody has trouble with pests, especially here in North Carolina because of our high humidity. So choose disease-resistant varieties. And we'll talk more about how to choose varieties a little bit in the second half of the talk, but there are all sorts of varieties that are well suited to different diseases especially, and they're bred for that. Space plants properly for better air circulation. It is so tempting to take these little tomato plants and just cram them in right next to each other, but they actually need a couple feet of space at least, depending on the variety, to get good air circulation. The plants will grow bigger, they'll have better fruit set, and they're not as disease prone, so they'll survive longer. So even though it feels like you're going to get less, you're probably going to do better. Avoid overhead watering, keeps the leaves wet. I like a shower, my plants don't, right? So just keep that in mind. And scout regularly to find problems before they become established. And this is especially true with looking for yellowed leaves, damaged leaves, big fat caterpillars, any of this kind of stuff, right? It's always good to kind of take a look through your garden bed, see what's going on, and take care of problems as they arise. One really great way to help prevent, especially a lot of soil-borne diseases, is crop rotation. So this helps prevent pest and disease buildup. It's very, very useful, even though it does force you to basically maybe not grow your absolute favorite thing in that spot of land. It allows you to grow it more going forward, which is really helpful for any magic nerds at home, any other like children in the 90s, right? This is this idea of at the time you play, you sacrifice the land, but you get that land back, right? So you divide your growing area basically into separate spaces. The easiest way to conceptualize this would be to be a setup where maybe you have 4 different beds, and you actually kind of say, I'm going to plant tomatoes in bed 1 this year, bed 2 next year, bed 3 next year, bed 4, right? And you kind of march around like that. Consider different seasons, right? So a bed might be planted in something like tomatoes or eggplant or peppers in the summer, and then planted in kale in the winter, right? Those are very different plants actually. Designate cool season and warm season crops for each bed. So really taking advantage of your beds and planting them continuously, but in very different types of plants. And be sure to switch between groups. And what I mean by groups, and this is kind of what I was alluding to, is that different vegetables are related to each other. And what your goal is you're trying to plant from totally different groups, right? So Solanaceae are tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, and peppers, right? Kind of, I think of them as like the summer greatest hits. Legumes are beans and peas. Brassicas, things like kale, collards, kohlrabi, cabbages, Brussels sprouts, all of those things. Fun fact, a lot of those are actually the exact same species. We've just selected them for different things. And then finally cucurbits. So these are your squashes and your melons, right? So I can't just switch back and forth between tomatoes and peppers, right? I got to switch back and forth between tomatoes and melons or tomatoes and peas, right? Just thinking about that. And another thing you can do to really help keep down, especially disease pressure, is mulch, actually. So the many, many benefits of mulch: it helps decrease water needs and weeds. Weeds have a hard time coming up through mulch, and it helps hold the water in. It helps reduce disease pressure. A lot of diseases, especially on our warm season veggies, actually come from the soil, and they are splashed up by raindrops. And so if you have mulch covering that soil layer, it can't splash up the same way. It also helps you build your organic matter, right? That mulch breaks down into your organic matter. One of my absolute favorite mulches, you can use any biodegradable matter, about 2 inches to 4 inches deep. That's perfect. Herbicide-free grass clippings, though, are actually one of the absolute best mulches that you might just have, right? Like mow your lawn, and as long as you didn't use any crazy herbicides on there, you can actually just spread that right on the beds, even green. Most mulches you cannot use green. Grass clippings you can. It has to do with basically the way they have really unique carbon nitrogen ratios, but long story short, it's one of the few things you can use green, and it's just easy because you just mow the lawn and dump it on the bed and you're good to go, right? Keeps your soil covered. So with that, we are actually about halfway through. So I would love to stop, take our 10-minute break, maybe come back together at 7. We'll answer some questions, and I'll be here, but for folks who actually are like, no, I really wanted to go to the bathroom, don't worry, we're not going to start answering questions until 7. So I will see you guys back here then. How's the chat with Monica?
They have not inundated. I have 3 good questions for you that I've saved. I've answered just 1 or 2.
Nice.
So I think that you'll have a good few minutes to talk about these questions that these people are asking.
Great.
So you're golden. It's going very well. That was a very fast hour or 50 minutes. 45, whatever you want to call it.
Is it because you took a nap?
I muted myself. I had to make the drugs up for the dog. So I'm texting my husband, bring me the drugs. So I just made sure.
It's always a fun thing to text someone.
Yeah, and it always freaks me out when I don't notice immediately that somebody has popped into the meeting. So KH, I know that you've just joined us and we just went to break, and I will be back in just a few minutes. We're here, but we're not doing anything seriously official at the moment. So hang on.
Yeah, we're chatting. I'm here for chatting. I don't want anyone to feel like, oh my God, if I go to the bathroom,
No, I don't want any of these questions to be missed. There are some real good ones in here. So let's
yeah, I was part of a talk series last fall where apparently like the fact that they were answering questions during the break like gave people anxiety. And I was like,
well, I can understand that. I mean, honestly, this is just such great information that you don't really want to miss anything. I remember when I first learned it. So
it is fun. Well, and it's amazing to me too, because it's like, especially the second half, the veggie seed starting half, we have folks now, master gardeners now, who are just trying that out kind of in earnest for the first time, because it's not something that everyone does. Like, it's just not something that everyone, like it moves them.
Oh, well, I love my vegetables and I love growing them. So I'm totally a cool vegetable girl. I am not a summer. I can't eat any of the nightshades. So if you can't eat them, why fight what that is? Whereas during the wintertime, I will admit I'm a weenie. I have row cover over everything. So except for the occasional slug that manages to make it up during the season, up the sides of the raised beds. I was
like, no, so I was, my like first visceral love of gardening was actually tomatoes. My mom she would grow 20 or 30 plants growing up, and all the different varieties coming up. And there's a smell to a tomato plant that like to this day, you know how you have certain smells in your life where like they feel like they hit a part of your brain? They
transport you?
Yeah, where you're just like, oh. So I still have that with tomatoes actually really badly, especially young ones. But I am just like a total tomato lover, and I'm not a snob about it either. Like I grow hybrids, I grow whatever, I don't care. I just love them so much. And
I have always known that about you. I mean, I think probably the first time we met you, you were like, my name's Ashley and I love tomatoes.
And I love and I'm kind of here because I love tomatoes. Like,
oh my gosh. She has a doctorate, people. She has a doctorate. It is for the love of the tomato.
I just remember I was over at a store in Carrboro that sells specialty grow lights, and they were doing, they've done this for a long time, and you know, they were selling them for cannabis, right? For marijuana. That's what they were selling.
Oh yeah. Headshot. Oh yes.
Yeah. And it was so funny because they like gave me a copy of their special light catalog, and I was like, this is the most phenomenal thing ever. And I remember bringing it back with like all my notes, my like dog years and everything else, and being like, okay, let me tell you what I'm trying to grow. And the guy was like, I don't want to talk about what you're trying to grow. I was like, no, I'm here to grow tomatoes. I'm actually really here.
So the one that I was in last, have you ever heard, there's a product, it's a liquid form, it'll come to me, but it's very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And you see them on a card for like $4 or $5 for like 2 ounces, right? So I was in one of those shops. They have these things in like 30-ounce bottles, and you pay $50-$60 for it.
Yeah.
But it is the most awesome. If something's really not doing well and just needs a little help, it's a great.
Those liquid boosts. I mean, they just are like a kick in the pants. The plants love them.
Well, and we don't want to. We don't want to put forth any products. So I'm really glad that I can't remember the name. Sometimes the over 50-year-old brain comes in handy. But But it was amazing to me. And of course, when you're in there and you see who's working in there, you're like, yeah, they're not growing vegetables.
Yeah, no, they're not. But like
some amazing systems though. I want them.
Especially because actually it's really hard to get grow lights that are of the right spectrum to promote flowering. Like that's gonna be pretty hard nut to crack. And the fact that they've done that so efficiently and so effectively is like, there's a lot of really interesting plant science going on there.
There really
which is like hilarious to me given the crowd, but like there's a lot of really, really intense.
They're very serious about their plants.
They're very serious. And I respect that. Like from
that's
one
right.
plant to another.
I do too. No, but I want all the energy to go into something as fabulous as growing your own vegetables, because truly it's, and I think that this is completely silly. It's like giving birth. You look at this and you go, oh my God, look what I did. I mean, this stuff comes
I don't, but I conceptually.
Yeah, I have to tell you, you put these little seeds in the ground and then you go, oh my God, is anything going to actually come of this? I just don't know. And then before long, mesmerizing. You have this amazing, and you go, I'm like, I think I want kale tonight. And I walk outside and I do this, and I hope all the neighbors are watching me while I'm doing it. I carry in this big arm of greens. It's wonderful. It's just wonderful. And I know where it came from.
My favorite that I always think is really funny, and I tell my husband this every time, is when I do grow lettuce, because I'll wander out and I'll like be like harvesting kind of as I'm eating, like as we
do. And
like I'll come in and I'll be like, Ryan, it still thinks it's alive while I'm eating it. And he's just like, you're getting a weird pleasure out of this. And the organic fertilizers, a lot of the like well-rounded organic fertilizers are conceptually just like a ground up chicken.
Yeah.
Which is like awesome to me that you're making like blood offerings to the soil to like appease the gardening gods. Like I don't know what that chicken's eaten, so I'm not going to use it, although there are people who absolutely swear by it. No thank you. But I like a good blood offering.
Here's the way. So when I went to a Buddhist retreat once, this vegetable has spent all of its, stop laughing. Sorry. This vegetable spent all of its time growing just to nourish your body. So the fact that you're eating it makes it actually very happy, because that's what it was born to do. It
was born to reproduce. It doesn't care about me. It just doesn't understand what's happening. Okay. Anyway, all right.
Now,
Evolutionary biologist. Evolutionary biologist. That does not care about you. Okay. All right, everyone. So we are at 6:59. So I'm going to start scanning the chat real quick. I see we've had a couple.
I want to start at the beginning, okay? Where I've marked that I need to start telling you.
Do you want to read out? Okay. Do you want to read out?
I am. So Melinda wants to know, she's been amending her red clay over a period of time. The top 4 to 6 inches is different than what's underneath. What should or would she test?
So that is a great question. If the top 4 to 6 inches is dark, that's often it's like the organic horizon of your soil, and that is awesome that you're seeing that. So for most vegetable gardens, just that top 4 to 6 inches is actually totally sufficient. What you do is you go through and you take little samples 4 to 6 inches down, and you actually take a number of them and you mix them together and sample from that. There's some detail to that, but long story short, top 4 to 6 inches is good, maybe a little bit below, but you would be testing that.
All right, so Alicia, if I'm butchering that name, please, I'm sorry. If I do my tomatoes or anything, I guess, do I need to switch around what I put in the containers too?
Great thing about containers is that if you have the gumption for it, you can replace the soil every year. So you don't have to rotate crops, right? And if you have any problem with soil-borne diseases, just throw that soil out, start over. You might bleach down the container, but nothing more than that, and you're good to go, right? It's a total shortcut on crop rotation.
All right, so can I use fresh mulch in my vegetable garden beds? And I have no definition for fresh mulch for you.
Sure, so the only fresh mulch you can use is, well, there are 2. One, grass clippings work even when they're green, and actually of all the poops, rabbit poop works. All the other poops and all the other materials need to be composted.
Wow, that's right. I actually had rabbits just so I could use the manure straight into the garden.
It's because they eat their own poop and then they double digest. So anyway.
Laura, the slides will be, you'll get a website. Ashley, tell her again where the slides will be.
I will actually send them out as a PDF after this.
Wanda says, great job so far. Mackenzie, do cover crops apply to raised beds as well? And how do cover crops fit in if you do warm and cool winter crops?
Right, so cover crops are kind of your catch-all if you're not going to do warm or cool crops. But so what I would do is any type of soil, whether it's raised beds, rows, anything like that, you want to keep it covered, right? And that's what cover crops are doing for you. But if you're saying, I'm going to plant eggplant in the summer and I'm going to plant kale in the winter, you don't need a cover crop because kind of your kale is acting as a cover crop. The one thing I would consider is that sometimes you're going to want to go ahead and plant a legume, so a bean or a pea, just to get that nitrogen in the soil.
Ashley, could you, for Sarah and Alex and Heidi, could you please tell us again the ratio of soil to compost in your raised beds?
I would start at least 3 parts soil to 1 part compost. I would also note that I'm going to say 3 parts soil to 1 part compost. I'm not going to complicate that, actually.
All right. Let's see. Where can we get soil sample kits? How many samples should we get? How often should your soil be tested? Ed wants to know.
Soil sample kits are available from our office at 721 Foster Street. There's a blue cabinet on the north side of the building that's always got supplies and where you can also actually drop off samples from April through Thanksgiving. They're also available at some of the local lawn and garden places, but I can guarantee we always have them. You're going to want to test at least once to get started. You might want to test every 2 to 3 years after that, just so you know what's going on with your soil. And you want to take a test from what I consider to be each area, right? An area is a section of your soil that has been historically treated the same and which you will treat the same moving forward, right? So if I have a whole bunch of lawn and it's been lawn and it's going to keep being lawn, that's 1 sample. If I have vegetable garden beds and they've been vegetable garden beds and they're going to keep being vegetable garden beds, that might even be 1 sample, right? But we can talk through more detail on that if folks have questions. And we have some good information on that.
All right.
I'll actually include my link on soil sampling.
Pam wants to know, and this is a ever perennial difficult question. Any suggestions to get rid of squash vine borers?
We'll talk about it, but no.
All right. Yeah, right.
I have that coming up. Move north where there's only 1 season. The small knife that I carry with me every day, I originally bought specifically to cut squash vine borers out of a friend's squash vines. No, I don't have a good solution.
You can read about things that people do to try to keep them from catching out of the soil and getting into your plant every year, collars and stuff like that. All I can say is good luck. I've stopped growing.
There are other varieties. The soft stem squashes, which are typically the summer squashes, are much more susceptible. I would say switch to hard stem squashes, which are like the winter squashes. But if you want a zucchini, it's hard.
Yeah. Ashley, KH wants to know about using seaweed as mulch. Salt content is the first thing that jumps to my mind.
My mind too. Yeah, I mean, I personally, it also sounds kind of expensive. I'm a little bit of a lazy, cheap gardener to a point. Sometimes I spend money on weird stuff. I'm willing to admit that. But I would just want to know more about what that product was, like very specifically, like what you're buying, because I would be worried about salt and I would be worried that it just was a little bit more than I needed. You know, if I can get away with grass clippings or old leaves.
So that brings us to another question of Alicia's. What are your favorite mulches besides grass clippings?
I like old leaves. I like compost. You can mulch with compost. So typically a lot of times what I'll do is I'll plant my beds and they're raised beds. And if I don't have grass clippings yet, because it's not that part of the season, I'll take some of my compost or I'll even buy compost and mulch with that.
All right. And last question I think that we need to answer right now is, so the soil test instructions say not to use galvanized tools when collecting your soil, because of course that will affect the outcome of your soil test in a way that you don't need it to. How does he or she know if his or her tools are galvanized?
So I will admit I'm not 100% sure. I always use a plastic tool because then I know it's not galvanized. The other thing I'll say is that a galvanized tool, what it will do to your soil sample result is it might make your zinc levels appear really high. So, you know, if you don't know if it was galvanized or not, but you find that your zinc levels are very high and you don't have like a tin roof, It was your tool, right? And I just wouldn't, that's more important actually for North Carolina farmers than for homeowners. And that's because a lot of times there are certain manure products that can put zinc levels really high. And NCTA is actually trying to track that. So for you, for your like nefarious home purposes, it's not as important.
All right, so for cover crops, green manure, how long before replanting would you till that into the soil?
I tend to, I mean, a little bit longer is better just because of like breakdown, but I mean, let's be real, like I tend to give it a week or two. Like I tend to get out there, my cover crops get away from me, they get too big. It takes me a weekend to cut them in because like I should have done it earlier. I'm tired, and then I plant the next weekend, right? That sort of schedule. And all of that is to say, I'm trying to also impress upon you that like, this is a science, but it's not, you know, physics. Like it's a soft science.
Yeah, there's errors. There's error of margin in both directions, always. All right, so I'm going to finish I mean, that's it for questions now.
Yep.
And we will save the rest of whatever comes in for the next half of the meeting.
Great. Okay.
And
let's do this thing.
And go.
Okay. So this second half is just going to be really focused on starting vegetables and also some varieties and some things to think about, right? So okay. Zoom, what are you doing? Okay, so there are two major types of crops, right, which you might have gathered. There are cool season crops and there are warm season crops. Cool season crops, these are the ones that are grown fall to spring. It's things like lettuces, broccolis, cabbages, onions, that kind of stuff, right? Warm season crops, which is, I think, apparently not everyone with Monica, but it's what I think captures a lot of people's imaginations to start. These are things that are grown after frost through fall. So basically between the last frost and the first frost. And it's going to be things like corn, melon, squash, pepper, tomato, eggplant, okra. And this is really the portion that we're going to focus on. Some of this others, what we're going to talk about with seed starting is broadly applicable to both groups. It's just easier to focus on one group at a time. So the most important thing about starting vegetables, either cool or warm, is really when to plant. And this is actually phenomenal because we have a really, really nice resource for Central North Carolina that was put together by NC State Extension. It's the Central North Carolina Planting Calendar, and I'll send you a link to that in the follow-up email after this talk. But it's basically anything you might want to grow, and it shows you a planting window, right? So what that means is it's going to say things like, oh, okay, you want to grow basil, this guy right here. So S is sow, like direct seed. T is transplant. And it's going to tell you basically between May and July, you can either direct seed or transplant, right? And it's really helpful. It tells you, you know, spacing, all sorts of different information you might need, just very, very helpful. The one thing I will point out is that these are very much planting windows, and be careful and kind of pay attention to nighttime temperatures especially. So at the beginning of some of these windows, early in the spring, if you know there's a frost or a freeze coming up, wait a little bit longer, right? Because you just have to get these things in the ground. I would say early to mid in the window. I wouldn't push it too hard. There are two major ways that you're going to do your planting. One of them is direct seed and one is transplant. And so a lot of us are kind of familiar with maybe buying transplants or starts out at the garden center or from the farmer's market or anyone else. And that is a totally great way to get plants. And I actually think it's a really good idea, especially if it's your first year direct seeding, maybe to try some direct seeding and then to know in the back of your head, if this doesn't work out, I'm going to go buy some beautiful transplants at the farmer's market, right? And so there's not too much pressure on you. There are definitely plants that are direct seeded and definitely plants that are transplanted. So some of the direct seeded ones, I think of these as being kind of the big seeded plants or the root plants, right? So it's going to be things like carrots have a small seed, but obviously it's a root plant. But beans, peas, potatoes, radishes, corn, right? So it's anything where it's got a big hefty root, and that's what you're really focused on. So you don't want to transplant it and disrupt that root, or anything where it's kind of got a big fat seed on it. Some of the transplants, this is a lot of the summer veggies, right? So it's going to be kale, okra, peppers, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, collards, right? So a lot of these things where it's actually a lot easier to get them started indoors and kind of transplant them out after you've got them all set and ready to go. And of course, there's some things that can be grown either way. So squashes and melons, lettuces, onions, and garlic, these can all be grown either direct seed or transplant. And it just kind of depends on what you're doing. A lot of folks do like to do squashes and melons direct seed, so putting the seeds straight into the ground. Lettuces and spinaches, it's basically whatever your preference is, right? Like everybody does that a million different ways. So when you're thinking about starting vegetables, one of the major questions you're going to have is, okay, so I know I want to grow tomatoes, or I know I want to grow peppers, or I know I want to grow whatever, but what sort of variety do I want, right? So all tomatoes are the same species, but they're all different varieties. So they're all different types. And the two major ways that we can think about varieties are as open pollinated. So these are going to be things like your heirloom varieties. Heirlooms tend to be a little bit older, but there are always new open pollinated varieties being developed. And the great thing about these is that you can save their seed and the varieties will come true to type. And what I mean by that is that these open varieties can pollinate themselves, can pollinate each other, and will produce seed that basically comes like the parent, right? And that works really well if you're interested in seed saving or are just concerned about that. Hybrids, on the other hand, these are recent crosses between parent varieties. And so what this might mean is like you have parent 1 and it produces a beautiful fruit that is so tasty, and you have parent 2 that is really, really disease resistant. And you cross the two together because you're hoping for a disease resistant plant with a tasty fruit, right? And so oftentimes those offspring will be a lot more uniform, they'll be a lot more vigorous, right? Like they will all, every little seed will kind of behave the same. The downside to that is that the next generation, if you were to save seed from those plants that you planted from that seed packet, they're going to span everything from parent 1 to parent 2 and everything in between, right? They're not going to come true to type. So if you're not much of a seed saver, but you're interested in disease resistance, this is a great way to go. If you're interested in some of these really old varieties where you can save seed, heirlooms are the way to go. I personally think a combination is really, really nice where you grow some heirlooms and some hybrids. This will always be listed on the seed packet, especially when it comes to things like tomatoes, right? So this little packet you can see here, right? Better Boy Hybrid, right? That's a hybrid seed and helpful. These are some of the diseases that it's resistant to. Tomatoes have all these like crazy special codes for disease resistance. The catalog you're buying from or going online, you can always find what those codes mean. Just kind of a little bit of interpreting a seed packet 101, because I know this can feel like a lot of information. I don't have any real bias at all towards Botanical Interests as a brand. I think they're fine. I just think they have like nicely labeled seed packets for explanation purposes. So this is a pretty typical tomato seed packet. First thing you're going to see is the variety, right? So here's the species, Solanum lycopersicum. It's a hybrid, right? And the variety is Supremo, right? That'll always be listed normally at the top. It is a determinate type. We'll talk about that more later with tomatoes, but that's pretty important. That means it wants to put all of its fruit out at once. This is also sometimes you'll often see bush tomatoes, bush beans. There'll be bush green bean varieties, and they are more inclined to put out all of their fruit at once, whereas the other varieties of tomatoes and beans are more inclined to put them out over time. You'll also have listed typically on the back of the packet disease resistance. So because this is a hybrid, it has increased disease resistance. It has excellent disease resistance, including Fusarium wilt 1 and 3, Verticillium wilt, root knot, blah, blah, blah. So these are soil-borne diseases that can actually be pretty bad in North Carolina. For tomatoes, some of the major soil-borne diseases we're worried about are things like Fusarium, Verticillium, and just some amount of disease resistance is good, right? Planting instructions. This is something where I do think that this brand does a good job. So they have, right, days to emerge, 5 to 10 days after planting, everything through to seed spacing, thinning, maturity, right? So 68 days from transplant, you're going to get your first fruit. They actually include it in 2 different formats. They also tell you basically when to start inside and that you really should start inside, right? Like it's recommended. That's very helpful. And finally, they tell you packing year. And this is very important. So these were packed December of 2019. They would have been great last year. They will be fine this year. They will be next year, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about how to store your seeds and how to test for seed germination. But know that the older a seed packet is, the worse the germination you're going to get typically. You got your seeds, you're super pumped. Look at any catalog and they will try to sell you all sorts of fancy things, right? They will try to sell you these beautiful plugs in a beautiful tray and it's wonderful. This can be done in a sandwich container, right? So we'll talk through some of that. So to start your seeds, you'll want a seed starting mix. Fresh potting soil also works. If you're going to use fresh potting soil, right? So you'll go to the store and you'll see seed starting mix and you'll see potting soil and they'll be different. Seed starting mix is a lighter potting soil and it has no nutritive value, right? It has like no nutrients in it whatsoever. And that's because the little tiny baby plants sometimes can get burned even by the small nutrient values. Fresh potting soil will actually also work. Just make sure it's not like a Miracle-Gro potting soil or something like that that has a lot of fertilizer in it, but it's a very, very low nutritional quality soil. That does mean you'll need to add fertilizer as they grow up. Oftentimes, if you look at fertilizer containers, they'll have seedling specific recommendations and just follow those. You always want to start out with clean pots and trays just to sort of keep disease at bay. Humidity domes can help, right? It can be the fancy one they sell you. It can be to the top of the sandwich container, right? This helps keep humidity up, especially when they're germinating. Once they're up, you want to increase airflow. You want to take that dome off. It's great to recycle materials by cleaning and adding holes, right? Adding just a couple of holes to the bottom of a tray for drainage means you're ready to go. I don't use them, but I personally always thought that roasted chicken containers looked great for seed starting. Another thing you'll be really concerned about is light. Really, really ideal is grow lights. They're not terribly expensive anymore. You can get them online for a pretty reasonable price. They're an investment that kind of keeps paying off. You basically want to keep them always 2 to 3 inches above the tops of the plants. So when there are just seeds and no plants, I keep them almost touching the trays. And as the plants get taller, I move them up. So they're always about 2 to 3 inches above the tops of the plants. A bright window can work, but make sure you're turning it regularly because you'll see the seedlings kind of reaching toward the window and you're trying to keep turning them to prevent that from too strongly happening. If you're using lights, you want to be about 16 hours on per day for most vegetable seedlings. So just set a timer. It's really easy. Lights will be on for 16 hours and then go off. One note is that when you're keeping those lights tight on the plants, make sure you're using LEDs or fluorescents for that. Incandescents get too hot. But if you have a bright south-facing sunny window, you can probably get away with that. That will probably work. Water. This is just like the adult plants. They want their roots moist and watered regularly, but they don't want their leaves wet, right? So I really, really like a setup like this, where I can actually lift this a little bit, just pour water down in the tray and let it absorb up, right? I don't like to water the soil itself. I actually like to water the bottom of the tray and let it come up. Or if I have to water the soil, just don't hit the leaves at all. One of the best things you can do with transplanted vegetables is actually transplanting them twice. And so this is going to sound crazy, but this is a technique that is really useful. It's called the seed bed, basically. And so what's going on here is these are pepper plants, and like 10 pepper plants were thrown in one tiny little pot space, right? And as they come up and as they get a tiny bit bigger like this, they're pieced apart and they're planted again, right? And then you can even do that one more time. Tomatoes especially, you basically keep sinking them down, where I would plant a tomato all the way up to basically right here on that plant, on any of those plants, and then I would do it again. And it would prevent it from getting leggy, and it produces a really strong, healthy, robust plant. This is a really good space saver because you don't have to give every single seed a plant, or every single pot a seed right up front, right? You can kind of grow as your plants grow. If you don't want to do that technique, like if you're not into all this like fiddly transplanting, which I get it, plant 2 to 3 seeds per pot and then thin if not using this method. Be honest with yourself about whether you can do that or not. I know a lot of people get really attached to their young baby plants and they don't want to thin them, right? Because what that means is I would have like 2 little plants growing up in the same pot, and whoever was weaker, I would go through and I would cut them off the top, right? If you don't have the heart to do that, Just put one seed per pot because your plant's going to be much happier if they're not crowded. You will be much happier if you do the cutting or the multiple transplant method because all your plants that survive will be stronger. Once you have your little seedlings, they have grown up under ideal, wonderful, beautiful conditions, and they're actually a little bit too fragile to go straight outside. So you're going to need to do hardening off to get them ready. And what that means is you move them slowly over the course of about a week from shade to full sun. The way I do this, a lot of times folks will do a process where it's kind of like you move them out into the sun for an hour and then you take them back inside. The next day you do 2 hours and then you take them back inside, 3 hours and you take them back inside. I, between the front of my house and my raised beds, which are in my front yard, is only probably 10 feet and I have a covered porch. So first day I leave them out on the covered porch and I kind of forget about them. Second day, I might move them to the edge of the covered porch. Third day, I move them onto the walkway. Fourth day, right? So I'm kind of doing that sort of system. But it's basically a process of acclimating them to more and more environmental conditions and more sunlight, more and more wind slowly over the course of the week. Move back to shade and water if wilting or burning occurs. And this is what that would look like, right? It's pretty strong. It'll basically just the whole leaf will like blanch out, and that is a sunburn basically. So it means those plants need to come back inside, or if they wilt really dramatically, water and then move them back inside because it was just a little bit too much pressure too early on. If you pay attention to your plants, they kind of tell you what's going on with them. You know, if they act real dramatic, it's like, take it easy and give them some water. So for seed storage, and to make sure you have good germination rates and you don't spend money on all these fancy varieties and then, you know, they don't last, germination rates naturally drop over time, especially over 2, 3, 4 years, right? Fewer and fewer and fewer of the seeds will be viable. So what that means is that if you have 10 seeds, maybe the first year, 9 would germinate, second year, 7, 5, 3, right? So if I were to plant all 10 seeds from a packet in the 4th year, I will get plants. I just certainly won't get 10, if that makes sense. The ways that you can help this are to store seeds in cool, dry conditions. The crisper drawer of your fridge is actually perfect. So I store all my seeds for veggies and for everything else in the crisper drawer of my refrigerator. We actually have a whole crisper drawer that's just seed storage, and that works really, really well for germination. I also do go through and throw out old packets at least every couple of years, you know, when I realize like I'm being too optimistic how long they'll last. If you have a variety that you just love that you're going to have a hard time getting again, you can also do a germination test. What this means is it's like the experiment you used to do in elementary school with beans, right? Where what you do is you take a paper towel, you wet it, wring it out so it's wet, it's not sopping wet, and then you would put maybe 5 to 10 seeds on that paper towel, put it in a plastic bag so it'll stay wet, and put it in a sunny window. Right, come back and check. And when you see those little tiny roots emerging, and you'll see them, they're very, very small, or you even see leaves emerging, right, that one germinated. So if over 2 weeks, 3 of 5 germinated, right, I know I have a 60% germination rate for that seed, roughly, right? And so it allows me to kind of test my germination rate for seed without having to pot it all out. Similarly, if you had seed that you were worried about the germination rate, but you knew you wanted to grow a fair bit of it, that would be a really great time to use that seed bed technique where you just drop a bunch of it on the soil and transplant out however many you get. Some of the problems that you might run into with veggies. So, and these are all really solvable. And again, worst case scenario, you just get to go out and buy vegetable plants, and that's fun too. If you have poor germination, it's often an ambient temperature thing. You want your germination area to be around 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Seeds could be too old. They could be planted too deep. There could be too much or too little water. For planting depth, it will always say that on the seed packet. And the majority of things like to be about a 1/4 inch down, but some things like carrots require sunlight to germinate. So it's just good to read the back of the packet because the back of the packet will basically tell you what to do. Tall, leggy seedlings. Oftentimes it's an issue of light or crowding, or that you started things too early. Again, like tomatoes are a great example of this, where what will happen is if your tomatoes are way too crowded, they will actually sense each other and they will try to outcompete each other for sunlight. And so they will actually all race to the top, right? And they'll get really leggy fast because everybody individually is like, I'm gonna win, I'm gonna get to the light and steal all of it from you guys, but they all did it kind of at the same time. So they all got leggy and that was no benefit. The other time that you'll see it with some veggies is if the pot is too small for the veggie, right? You planted it too early, it got too big, and now it's a little bit root bound. Sometimes they'll get leggy because of that, because basically they are having a stress condition in their roots and they're trying to basically mature quickly because they think they don't have what they need to survive. And so they want to just like mature or reproduce before they die. Yellow or discolored leaves, it's likely a nutrient deficiency, especially in seedlings that are inside. Add just a balanced fertilizer according to the label on that fertilizer. This is a time, right, when I would think about a liquid fertilizer because I'm seeing it at an acute deficiency, right? So that's a great time to focus on something like a liquid fertilizer and to just follow the directions on that for seedlings and young plants. So kind of an overview of who's who of the warm season vegetables, right? So what we're going to do is as we cover these warm season vegetables, you'll see a key in the upper right-hand corner of each slide about whether this is something you transplant or whether it's something you direct seed. And again, remember, if you want to grow something and you're not quite sure what, go back to that Central North Carolina planting calendar and it will tell you what is preferred, right? And there will even be some things where you might transplant them during some seasons and other seasons you might direct seed them, or kind of windows change. So it's just really good to always go back and consult that to make sure you're doing things kind of at the right time. First, sweet corn. I mentioned it earlier, I am personally amused a little bit by people growing corn here because in my mind, being from central Indiana, if you don't grow corn by the hundreds to thousands of acre, I don't know what you're doing, but corn is pretty cool and it's definitely part of some traditional planting schemes. It does need a lot of space. You want to have blocks of at least 3 to 4 rows. That's because corn is actually wind pollinated, not pollinated by a pollinator. And you need to have basically varieties that are going to line up with each other and pollinate each other. So you need these kind of big blocks. It does need a lot of nitrogen and a slow release form. And one thing you can do is stagger your plantings every 2 weeks to get corn a little bit more continuously. It's a fun plant and there are a lot of really, really cool, interesting, especially decorative varieties. Fun fact, some of the craziest things we've discovered in genetics were actually discovered in corn. You know, those crazy like Indian corns that have all the different color size kernels. It's like a gene that just jumps around and slices itself into different places. So there's some cool plant biology in corn. So, that's always fun. Legumes, this could be things like beans, so lima, butter, green, all your basic beans. Butter and lima beans don't produce well in hot weather. For green beans, you have both bush and pole varieties. Bush are short, obviously they're bushy and they tend to put on their beans more at once. Pole do need support structures because they're going to go up. Don't make the mistake I always mistake. Don't make your poles higher than you can reach, because then you can't get your beans. So you need to figure out a scheme for how you're going to get to the highest beans if you have pole beans. Southern peas, there are field peas, black-eyed peas. These do need really warm soils. So, these are better kind of in the heat of the summer. And peanuts, which I just think peanuts are really, really interesting too, because like the peanut, as you can see from this, right, it grows out from the stem, grows underground, and then the nuts grow underground, but from like above ground structures, which is crazy. So that's pretty cool. Some of the cucurbits you might want to grow, so squashes and melons. Cucumbers are about 45 to 50 days to maturity. Summer squash and zucchini are similar. These can be very productive. They can also be very large plants, so you probably don't need more than 1 or 2 plants. They're big, they take space. You can plant up to the cotyledons or sow direct. And what I mean by that is that you can either put the seeds straight in the ground, sow direct, or you can transplant them, but when you transplant them, you sink them a little bit, and I'll show you what that means. One thing I would like to point out, because we always get calls about this, is that on most of these squashes, there are actually male and female flowers. And the male flowers, actually come on slightly before the female flowers. And so, for example, this flower right here is on a long, thin stem. That's a male flower. This flower right here is on this big fat cucumber, right? That might be a zucchini. I'm really bad at telling them apart. It's kind of embarrassing, but it's true. That is on a female flower. So oftentimes what will happen, because the male flowers come on first, is you'll be so excited about your squash plant and you will wander out and it will be full of flowers. It's beautiful, and then no squash will come. Those were all male flowers. You got to wait for the flush female flowers a little bit later. This is why often early in the season you can buy squash blossoms at the farmer's market before you can buy squash, right? Because you can fry up squash blossoms and they're delicious. And those were all those male flowers that came on first. So if you're not quite sure what you're looking at, remember the female ones are the ones with this big structure that actually turns into the fruit, right? Whereas the males are much thinner and they're just producing pollen. So on this point about cotyledon or seed leaves, all the plants you'll be growing basically as worm seeds and veggies have this sort of structure, right? This is true for all dicots, all of this type of plant, where they have these first two leaves, and you'll see it on tomatoes, peppers, anything else, beans especially, they look really different. First two leaves are called the seed leaves or the cotyledon, and they're not like the other leaves. They're different, right? These are the true and proper leaves, and you can see they have veins and they're a little bit fuzzy and all that. These you can tell are thicker or waxier, they're shaped differently. And so oftentimes those seed leaves will just shrivel up and fall off. But what you can do is when you're planting your cucurbits, basically you would plant them right to about here, right? You just sink them right down to that level. You get those seed leaves right on the ground level, and that will give you a slightly stronger plant. One of the major things you might run into with these guys is downy mildew. This is especially on cucumbers. It can be especially bad on pickling cucumbers. It often wipes out late crops. There's no good way for homeowners to treat it. For commercial growers, we have like yearly downy mildew watches to figure out how it's progressing through different people's fields. It's just kind of hard to deal with, but what's interesting about it from a plant like disease and plant pathology perspective is these super super linear way it progresses, right? So it only goes between veins. And so to me, it almost even looks like a little patchwork quilt, right? It's not these big round blobs, it's just specific little spots between veins. And so you'll see these very, very angular discolorations start showing up. Once you have that, I would rip that plant out. And I wouldn't compost it, I would throw it away. Some of these diseases are bad enough you don't want them going in the compost bin. You just want to get rid of them. We had a question about this earlier, squash vine borer. This hits especially the summer squashes. Plant as early as possible. That's very helpful. You're trying to get basically a crop before these guys fly. Unfortunately, here in North Carolina, we have a long enough warm enough season that we have two major generations of these guys. So even if you get your plants through the spring, they're probably going to get walloped later on. This is a moth, I believe. Yeah, this is a moth, and basically what happens is she lays her egg right at the base of the squash plant in that vine. Caterpillar crawls in, and then it eats out all of this like central part of the vine, right, and just kills it. So what'll happen is you'll walk out and your like big beautiful plant will have just wilted, like it'll just like fallen apart. No amount of watering will bring it back, and that plant's destroyed. Some people will wrap the bases of stems in tinfoil. Some people will cut out the caterpillar if they can find evidence of it when it's young enough. You'll typically see caterpillar poop all around a hole. But this can be pretty hard to deal with. And it's one of those things that I personally don't grow squash anymore because the plants are big, I have limited space. And right around the time that I have squash, the whole world has squash, and squash is very, very cheap. So that for me just doesn't really work. One thing you can do is just rotation and sanitation. If this guy is allowed to survive, he will actually drop out and he will turn into a little pupae or cocoon in the soil, and he will come from that same spot when he emerges as an adult. Another thing that some people have success with is just covering their whole plants with row cover when they know the squash vine borers are flying. So they're basically just shutting down those plants during that window to try and protect them. Some success. The winter squashes are much less susceptible to that, the hard vine squashes, but not totally, right? They're not totally impenetrable. The soil needs to be warm. The ornamental gourds are the easiest. There are some really cool ornamental gourds. So you have things like the loofah sponge, the birdhouse gourd, some really, really cool kind of charismatic ornamentals in this group. Pumpkin and winter squash can be a little bit hard and can require fungicide sprays really to control some of the leaf diseases, some of the foliar diseases. So just be aware of that. Melons like it really warm, and their nutrient levels are pretty important for them. So just test your soil before you start with these guys. I saw a question in the chat about whether you would test soil in raised beds. I would. I just would. So I know what I was dealing with, right? You know, if I test a couple of years and it's always the same, that's one thing. But I like to test just to always know what I'm dealing with. Cantaloupe prefer slightly drier conditions. Watermelons like it a little bit moister. Some of the seedless varieties, it sounds like a good idea, but they can be finickier. So I would start with something like Crimson Sweet or Jubilee. These are just very reliable varieties in this area. I kind of just want to talk about tomatoes. One thing I want to say about tomatoes, just to like let everyone off the hook, tomatoes are actually a little bit of a varsity level sport in North Carolina, in this area of the Piedmont. The reason I say that is because, again, we have very warm, humid conditions that never give the plants a chance to relax at night, that make them disease prone. It can get so hot that tomatoes can't even form flowers that will pollinate properly. So the blossoms will literally just drop off plants. Like, they can be hard to grow around here. It's not you, right? Like, it's not you. It's a noble pursuit. But if it's hard and you feel like you have a bad year, just try again if you're still passionate about it, because tomatoes can be actually quite difficult. If you're interested in tomatoes, there are many ways to classify them, right? So we have large fruited, sometimes they're called slicers, oxheart, which are kind of shaped like an oxheart. That's what those varieties are. Paste, those are low moisture content tomatoes that are really good for canning and for sauces. Grape, cherry. Dwarf or small varieties that can have actually any number of different types of tomatoes. There's determinate versus indeterminate, and there's heirloom versus hybrid. We'll walk through what some of those distinctions mean really quick. One thing I will say is that if you're new to tomatoes, or just like being realistic, it's really good to stay away from the largest fruited varieties here in North Carolina, in this area of the Piedmont. I would stick with cherries, grapes. I might go as large as kind of a medium-sized tomato, but I wouldn't go with the biggest varieties. Those can be the most difficult to grow here because it takes them so much time to mature on the vine that they're just open to every single assault that can hit them, right? If you stick with a small to medium-sized tomato, you're going to have much better success. If you're new to tomatoes, start with cherries. Start with a cherry variety and see how it goes. So for determinates versus indeterminates. So determinates have a smaller overall size. They set fruit over a short period, right? Like once they start setting their fruit, they tend to set most of their fruit in this short window. They'll kind of lag on a little bit, but most of the fruit set comes in that short window. And they're better suited for container gardening. Indeterminates can grow very, very tall. They must have support. I've seen indeterminates that were grown in commercial production settings where they're truly vines, right? Like they're 10, 15 feet long, right? So these can get huge. These are the ones that will tower over you. And they have fruit production throughout the season. A tomato cage will not hold an indeterminate tomato, right? You have to have basically a whole meaty support structure for that. And I'll send more information about that in the links afterwards. But if you have container setting, look for determinates or look for some of the new dwarf varieties that are coming out. That's kind of a newer classification. Sometimes they're just smaller plants and they kind of produce in different ways. They've been selected for different things, but they're smaller plants overall. And a lot of them were really developed and proved here in North Carolina. So we know they're good for our area. Tomatoes are like the even more extreme version of planting up to those first leaves, right? So for tomato planting, what you want to do is a lot of times, especially if your plants are leggy, but in general, you can actually sink them down pretty far. So don't leave the pot on. I don't know why they did that in this picture, but don't leave the pot on. But see, that thing's planted actually quite deep. This thing was leggy, right? This tomato was leggy. And what they did was they took off all those little leaves along the side and they actually planted it like in a trench like this. All of this tissue down here will form roots and it will give you a really nice, good, strong root structure. So it's always good to plant your tomatoes pretty deep and just make sure you prune them so that none of the leaves are touching soil. As your tomatoes grow up, prune those leaves up so that the bottom leaves are eventually about 8 to 12 inches off the soil line. That's just to help prevent disease. Peppers, very, very easy once they're started, but germination can be tricky. Some of the hottest varieties, I think, are some of the hardest to germinate. Using a heat mat under your germination or even starting the seeds in water can be helpful. What I mean by that is you take like a little tray of water and you put your pepper seeds in there, and then each day you come back and you see if any roots have emerged. They're gonna be tiny. You gotta like have good eyes or use your magnifying glass, and then you would put that in soil. They can be very, very productive when they're fertilized. And obviously one of the most important things to think about with peppers, how hot do you want it, right? Many of us have heard of the Scoville heat index. You have things down here that are absolutely no heat all the way up to ghost peppers, things that are new varieties that are coming out that are even hotter. Those new varieties that are even hotter, I don't realistically really know what people do with them other than like brag that they made them. So it's often nice to stay kind of in a heat range that like you might actually fathomably use as something other than hot sauce. But unless you're a hot sauce person, then like knock yourself out, ghost peppers all the way. Eggplants are fascinating because not everybody likes them, but they're used in so many different cuisines. And so there are so many different varieties, right? All of these things on the right are different types of eggplant. You want to wait to plant them when it's warm. Fall crops do well, where you can plant midsummer and then get an additional fall crop. And there are many varieties available based on cuisine. So, right, eggplants feature prominently in Indian cuisine, Italian, many Asian cuisines like Thai. And so you'll have all sorts of different varieties based on just what it's going to be. There's always the great classic Black Beauty. That's that sort of Italian eggplant that you think of, but there's so many other interesting things to try. Japanese eggplants. So this is kind of a really fun group. Okra. Okra is really fun because okra produces really, really, really well. Too well, actually, for most people, right? You have to harvest the pods when they're 2 to 3 inches long. If it's longer than that, it's not going to be very tasty. And so people will find that they have to harvest their okra almost every day, if not every other day. Otherwise, it just totally gets away from them and like it gets too big and it's not tasty and it's like tough. The cool thing though is that okra has a beautiful flower, right? So you can see this here is a really, really pretty flower. It's in the same group as actually hibiscus and actually cotton, fun fact. So worst case scenario, if your okra plant gets away from you, it's still a really pretty tall flowering plant. And so I like to plant okra just because like I give up on it about halfway through the season, but then I have beautiful flowers and that makes me happy. So it's kind of like a success even in failure. You do want to rotate crops to avoid nematode problems with okra, so little worms in the soil, but that's not hard because you're probably not going to plant that much okra. I can't give a veggie talk in North Carolina without talking about sweet potatoes. I just can't do it. I'm like contractually bound to talk about sweet potatoes here. They need a lot of space. You want to start with certified slips or cuttings, right? You start sweet potatoes from little cuttings. Deer do love sweet potato vines, so just be aware of that if you know you have a lot of deer pressure. Once you have your sweet potatoes and once you've harvested them, don't wash them, but store in a garage or a shed that's about 80 degrees with damp burlap over them for 5 to 10 days, right? This will help to increase the sugar content. So they require a little bit of post-harvest care to get them really perfect. Not really a vegetable, but everyone's curious about it. Let's talk about herbs for just a second. So herbs kind of exist along this spectrum from annual to perennial, right? So from living 1 year to living many years. What do I mean by that? You have things like basil, dill, and even parsley, which basil is a hardcore annual, like it will die at frost. On the other hand, you have things like rosemary, right? Where our rosemary bushes around here get big and lush and vast, right? And they just persist. And one of the things to think about is that these herbs are going to exist on really different timescales and that they also actually have really different planting conditions they like. This is a simplification, but it's right in most cases, that the more perennial the herb, the more it actually likes dry, well-drained conditions, right? Rosemary tolerates some drought. It actually quite likes it. It likes bright sun, likes good drainage. Basil wants to be nice and moist and wet, right? So the more annual it is, kind of the more moist, lush condition, the more perennial, the more dry, well-drained condition. This means that when you're putting together a planter, you might not actually want to have basil in with something like sage for a time, because they actually have different water conditions they like. I would probably keep basil with basil. Basil also is planted really, really well along with tomatoes and things like that. Whereas I would keep some of those dry conditions, some of those more perennial herbs in just with themselves. And I think they'll be happiest that way. The one herb that needs to be in a pot is mint. Contain your mints. They will get out of control. They will take over gardens. They will take over homes. They are crazy. They will go everywhere. So just, it's always good to have your mints planted in a pot, because that kind of gives them a space that they can take over that can be all their own without taking everything over. So just make sure you contain them. I would be remiss if I didn't just take one extra second to sing the virtues of basil. It's extremely easy to grow from seed or transplant. If you're just thinking about getting started with warm season vegetables and growing your own food, get yourself a basil plant. You are going to have a relatively good success, unless you totally forget to water it. It's one of the easiest things to kind of just get your hands dirty with, see how it goes, and kind of build out from there. There are many varieties based on cuisine, right? So you have all sorts of citrus flavored basils, Italian, Thai, right? All sorts of really interesting basils that you can do. And basil is just delicious. And importantly, when you harvest basil leaves, you actually don't want to like pull off individual leaves, which seems very gentle and a nice way to do it. You want to actually pinch back whole stems. And what I mean by that is that if I were looking at something like this basil down here, these are flowers coming on. I always want to prevent the flowers, because the flowers will make the leaves taste crummy, kind of bitter. I would actually pinch the whole stem, maybe like right there, right? Or I would come in, I would pinch the whole stem right here. This one, I might pinch the whole top of the, right? Just grab the whole top, because what will happen is it will grow back bushier and with more lateral growth. So it'll grow back like a little shrub, which is great. So just prevent the flowers and harvest leaves by pinching back. Worst case scenario, it's another one like okra, where if it accidentally flowers, like that's still a very attractive little plant. So that's okay, but it won't taste quite as nice. So a lot of what we've covered in this seed starting section is actually from this really great publication from the University of Georgia Extension, all about seed starting. You can see I use their graphics. I'll include a link to that, but it's just, I want to give that a huge shout out for kind of, if you're like, that was a lot of facts really fast, like I just want to read it through once. This is a great resource for that. So with that, I will put up my contact information. I will admit there's a star next to my email, because I'm way better by email than by phone if you want to catch me. But I will say that's about it. And Monica, what do we have for questions?
All right, so our first one, Anja wants to know how we can control flea beetles on eggplants.
Interesting. I spent a lot of last summer with someone actually who was like trying to pick them off by hand and infuriated, and that was not working. I would say something like, I would be starting with something like a food grade diatomaceous earth. That'll do a really good job knocking back most insects. Beetles are always going to be a little bit harder because they're hard bodied, right? Like the soft bodied insects you can hit with insecticidal soap. But something like that, a food grade diatomaceous earth, is probably where I would start.
All right, I think it was HB that asked, do you need a fan for indoor planting of seeds?
People like that. People do really like it. So the theory behind using a fan on your plants is that many indoor started seeds are wimps, because they've never had any real environmental conditions applied to them, right? Like they just have grown up in like wonderful little utopias. And so a fan is just enough to apply some pressure to stiffen up the stems. So I know that folks do like doing that. It helps, especially with tomatoes and other things like that, they can get leggy. If you don't have a fan, or you just don't like the font feels like too much, I tend to rake my hands across the top of the plants at least once a day too. When I go in to check on them, I just kind of, and that's enough to get them to toughen up a little.
All right, so Robin wants to know, hi Robin, how many weeks prior to the last frost date should seeds be started? It seems like we're already a bit too late for starting tomatoes and potatoes.
We are not. So tomatoes are 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost. Last frost here is April 15th roundabouts, but like climate change. So that's hard.
So if you think about not potatoes, peppers, I'm sorry, Robin.
Yeah, no, peppers. So peppers I tend to start a little bit later than tomatoes, right? So peppers might be more like 4 to 6 weeks, but the packets will tell you. But so that actually puts us right now at a good starting window. And the other thing I'll say to keep in mind, right, is that I plant April 15th. I know a lot of people who plant May 1st. So you don't have to be right on the money, right? You're trying to hit a window. You're not trying to hit a date. So I would say now for the next month, next 6 weeks, you're good for starting seeds.
Absolutely. All right. So Diane T wants to know about seed starting. Perhaps mention overwatering / dampening off.
Yeah, right. That's a great question. So I'll go ahead and stop share so we can see each other better. Damping off is a condition that can happen when you have too much water, and it's a disease condition basically where the plants will come up, they'll be beautiful, and then the stem will basically die at the soil line, or sometimes they don't even make it past the soil line, right? Like they just won't come up right. If you are starting with sterile media, which is like new potting soil, you probably will be okay and that shouldn't happen to you. However, don't let things sit in crazy water, right? Like go through and like you add water to the bottom of the tray or to the pot, you know, and the next day when you come back, before you add more, give that soil a poke, you know, poke an inch to a ½ inch down to see if it's moist or if it's wet, right? If it's wet, don't add more water. If it's moist to a little bit dry, add more water. That's really the best way you can prevent that.
All right. Alice would like to know if you should remove the male flower from cucumber or zucchini.
Nope, the female flower needs it. Right, so that's one of those plants that decided to make males and females separate flowers as opposed to many plants which make males and females the same flower. But if you got a female flower, you need the male flower to have that really good pollination leads to good fruit development.
And what size container do you recommend for starting seeds? Like how big for each little square?
Sure, it depends on how long you're going to have them in there. If I was going to plant in a pot that was the same pot that I was eventually going to transplant directly out of into the garden, right? So like I'm doing a 1-pot system. I'd probably be looking at something about in this range, right? It's like a 3 to 4 inch, somewhere like this. I personally would start probably 20 seeds in this pot, and then I would break it out each into its own individual pot of that size myself, right? Just because I want to see how the success rate goes. But really, the other way you can tell is if you think that your pot's getting small, pick it up, look at the bottom, and you'll start seeing these roots that are kind of poking out the edges and poking out the corners and making a break for it and going every different direction. That's when the plant's getting root bound, and that's when it's worth moving it up a pot size or transplanting it out. And don't worry if it gets a little bit root bound. It's really not a big deal. All it means is that when you transplant it to the next pot or you transplant it out to the garden, just rough up that root ball a little bit, rip that up just a little bit, and put it in the ground, and it'll be fine.
Okay, and well, no, not quite the last one. Okay, so right now we know that the USDA, they charge up until April 1st when it becomes free again. But right now, Ashley, the best way to do this, they have on the side shipping, how to put it into another box and ship it to the USDA in Raleigh. But yeah, Diane wanted to know if she could just go take the dirt in a plastic bag and put it in the box at the office. But then she can't leave them at the office, I don't think. You know, we're not carrying them to the USDA.
Yeah, we won't be taking them over until April basically. But if you want to get the supplies from our office, like we're saying, right, that lab is actually just over in Raleigh, and the address for the lab is at the very top of the sheet that you have to submit with that soil sample. And you can take it over yourself and you can drop it off at any time at their loading dock and they'll invoice you.
And it is right off of 40. It's not difficult to get to.
Yeah, it's by the art museum.
And we are going to start transporting those?
Yeah, the cabinet was built to accommodate that.
Wow. Awesome. All right, wait a minute. Let me see what we have here at the bottom. We have 2 new messages. How about vermiculite for seed starting?
Folks like it. I am personally too lazy to buy that many specialty soil products, which is why I plant everything in a basic potting soil without much nutritional value. But vermiculite will be really good, but you will have to add fertilizer and you'll have to pot it up into something else eventually.
And sounds like hydroponics would be the funner way to go there, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Is there compost testing? Tabia wants to know. And there is, but it's a little different.
Yeah, it is a little different, and it's not really for the home gardener, it's not really worth it. What they do is they do solid waste testing, and that's actually more like where they're testing chicken litter, they're tasting what comes off of hog lagoons, they're testing all these different things because farmers like to apply that to their field, and so they test that so they know the nutritive value. I wouldn't worry about it. Your compost is mostly organic matter unless there's a lot of animal manure in it, at which point it's probably got some phosphorus and potassium in it too, and some nitrogen.
And I think that those used to be about $8. And
yeah,
I don't think they're
more
ever
expensive,
free.
and it's like a little bit of a funny process. If you want to do it, just reach out to me and we'll figure it out. So with that, one last comment I want to make real quick, and we'll keep taking these, is that, we'll talk about the herbicides and compost. I'm going to send you an email, send all you guys an email tonight or tomorrow morning, first thing. And one of the things, it's going to be a whole bunch of resources that we've talked about here. It's going to be my slides. It's going to be all sorts of stuff. Some cool stuff about how you can save money on rain gardens and cisterns if you live in Durham. At the top, though, is going to be a survey. And that is just going to be for me to get feedback from you guys and how this all went. And that is super important. It's a huge part of what we do at Extension so that I can know how to keep improving this. Normally, this is a class we charge for. We're obviously not charging this year totally free of cost, but one payment I would love is if you would fill out the survey just so I can figure out how to keep making this talk better and just kind of keep improving things. So please keep your eye out for that. And one last question, just because this is something that's come up a lot in the past year, and I feel like a lot of folks have probably heard about it, is herbicide contamination in compost. Monica did do a great job moderating. But so
thank you for that feedback. I'm good.
So herbicide contamination in compost, this is something that you'll hear a lot about in this area. There was a bad batch of it, especially last year, which was really, I think, heartbreaking for a lot of folks because it was right around the time that they really needed their gardens. It was kind of when we were all first shutting down and we really needed that space to work for us, like for soul reasons. What that contamination is, for the most part, is it's contamination with an herbicide that farmers tend to use in pasture to manage broadleaf weeds. So to manage non-grasses in grass. It's a really, really, really good product because it's got a really long life. So a farmer needs to apply it once and it might last for 3 or 4 months. Tomatoes are extremely susceptible to it though. So if you look at the label for that product in like big, bold terms, it's like, never let this hay leave the farm, never let this cow poop leave the farm, right? Like anything that herbicide touches is never supposed to leave the farm. But sometimes it does, and it's totally an accident, and no one's trying to be malicious or do anything bad, but sometimes it happens, and then it gets mixed into compost, and it lasts a little bit too long, and the tomatoes have a hard time processing it, especially. Other plants can show it too, but tomatoes kind of wear their heart on their sleeve about it. The bad news is that it's really hard to test for because it exists in such tiny quantities, and it's really hard to track, and it's a total bummer. The good news is that it tends to only last a year. And UV radiation, so sunlight breaks it down. So if you have that happen to you, I'm sorry, it's heartbreaking. I know it's heartbreaking, but your soil should be okay within about a year. And I would just consider making your own compost for your vegetable beds if you're really concerned about it. So that's kind of that one.
Ashley, do you think that clipping the tops of the tomatoes makes the tomato plant produce more tomatoes? Oh my God, she's already excited before she even answers the questions. I didn't try it yet. Gabriella, experiment, but here's the expert.
My suspicion, and it's a very strong one, is that it will produce the same overall tomato mass. So it might produce more tomatoes, but they will be slightly smaller, right? So oftentimes these sort of trade-offs happen, right? Where you're going to have like that tomato plant can produce a certain mass of tomatoes, and it's either going to produce fewer large tomatoes or more small tomatoes. And so I think it will produce more smaller tomatoes, but they're still going to be like a good size. Like you're still going to be happy.
They'll still be very edible.
Yeah, it'll still be like a great sandwich. Don't worry about it.
All right. Eleanor has a question.
Nope.
Mm-mm.
Not here. No, they're totally happy. They're totally happy. They want as much sunlight as they can possibly get. You know, especially in downtown Durham, we struggle more with not enough sun than too much. So with that, we are at 8 o'clock, and I want to just kind of be respectful of everyone's time. Please keep sending me questions as you have them. Please keep, I'll talk things through with you. Master gardeners would love to hear from you. We'd love to talk to you about soil testing, anything else that you might be interested in. Check out the rest of the talk series. Hopefully they will all be as full as awesome participants as this one was. So thank you guys so much again. I'm going to stop recording.